And you're all part of the independent digital transformation movement here by being part of Transformation Ground Control. So thank you for listening, everyone that's here today. I've got a really exciting show today. I'm particularly excited about the topics at hand and the guests at hand today because we're talking a lot. Coincidentally, all the discussions are going to focus on business growth, high growth businesses, small businesses, mergers and acquisitions. And that's something I think we can all relate to, or we've all seen quite a bit of in these changing times that we're in right now. And just to give you some preview of what we'll cover here today, our first guest on the show is going to be Adam Cheatham, who's a director of strategy and transformation within Third Stage Consulting. And he's going to unpack a case study for us of a recent project that we had been working on that focuses on helping a client define its digital strategy and evaluate potential technologies in the context of extreme growth through merger and acquisition. So it's a company that started off fairly small, got private equity funding, went out and acquired a bunch of companies, and then they hired us to figure out how to create a digital strategy for this conglomerate of different companies that they had acquired. So that'll be the first guest on the show today. And then later in the show, we're also going to have Christy Barber on. We have an interview with her. Actually, Adam, who's our first guest, is interviewing her for that discussion, focused on small and mid-sized business transformations, digital transformations in particular. So Adam is actually going to ask her a series of questions. And for those of you that don't know, Christy Barber is a small business specialist. She manages most of our small business engagements here at Third Stage. So she's going to share some of her lessons and findings from helping small to mid-sized companies through their transformations. So the whole discussion today, the whole show, Paresa, is going to come back to business growth. It's going to be a lot of focus on mergers and acquisitions as well. And that's a topic that I know you and I have talked a bit about, and something that's been in the news quite a bit lately as far as companies going out and acquiring other companies. But what are some of your findings? I know you've done some research on this topic here recently.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I think the pandemic has really shined a light on the healthcare industry. And Forbes recently put out an article talking about their predictions for what mergers and acquisitions will look like in 2021. And a lot of it was geared toward the healthcare industry. I mean, I don't know about our listeners or you, Eric, but, when I think about businesses and organizations, the healthcare industry isn't the first thing that comes to mind. So it's interesting to read this because you're looking at your doctor's office as, where you go to get care. But it's a business, and they're operating to drive profits on their bottom line and figure out how to optimize their operations, right? So when you look at this kind of perspective that Forbes recently put out, they're thinking that, obviously the pandemic has put such a strain on the healthcare system. It's surgeries have taken a back seat because there's COVID patients coming in. So things have been shaken up a bit. And, at the end of the day, the goal or purpose of a merger acquisition is to increase efficiencies, figure out how to streamline operations by kind of going bigger. And that's the thought here. So their thought is in 2021, you're probably going to see doctors' offices, urgent cares, hospitals, et cetera, merging to be part of a greater healthcare system. And in hopes that it will improve the quality of care while lowering costs, So I think ultimately when you look at, where the world was going already, people are also looking for that one-stop shop. How can I consolidate my trip to the grocery store and run my errands, et cetera? So I think that's another perspective that they shared in this article is, you're going to see retail stores, drug stores, et cetera, people who aren't, or not people, but organizations who aren't necessarily in the healthcare industry as is, such as the Walmarts, the Walgreens, they're going to be adding those little clinics, those, different outlets so that people can consolidate their trips. And that's only going to be intensified with the pandemic because you have the added risk of exposure the more places that you go, right? So it's interesting to see For example, if you look at today's urgent cares versus maybe 5, 10 years ago, our urgent care nearby, it used to be the place that you went if you had an emergency, right? You have a broken wrist or something and you need help like right away, you go there. But now they are also doing annual checkups. They have, a family care physician, and it's just kind of pivoting and adjusting to the times. And I think this pandemic has definitely been a catalyst. So definitely interesting to see that perspective on the healthcare system. And, ultimately, it's all a good thing, right? Because it improves the level of care. Like if these hospitals and these healthcare facilities are able to operate in a more streamlined fashion, that's better for everybody. It's better for them. They're making more money. It's better for the patients because they're getting better care. Would you say that's kind of the same story outside of the healthcare system? I mean, looking at the whole purpose of a merger and acquisition, would you say that businesses are acquiring each other for the purpose of streamlining?
Yeah, it's a big part of it, and especially in today's day and age with the economy the way it is, it's in many ways, and not just in healthcare but other industries too. Like you said, it's created sort of some winners and losers in the space. So you've got some companies that are doing extremely well, that are extremely profitable. Maybe they're essential businesses like healthcare, and so they're growing and they have more resources at their disposal, like cash, to go buy other companies, or they're getting private equity money to go by other companies. And anytime you see a stressful economic situation, I know COVID's been more of a health concern, and that's been the focus for a lot of us, has been the health side of it. In addition to that, you also have the economic impact of how that's affecting the economy, and it is creating vulnerabilities for some organizations that are looking for a lifeline, and they're more willing to be bought by a private equity firm or another company. So anytime you see economic turmoil, usually that leads to a lot of M&A activity, and I think that's what we're seeing here. But the thing that's really interesting is, with healthcare, like in the example you're talking about, they're doing it as a way to streamline operations, become more profitable, and really create more scale. But what's interesting is as you were talking about that, I was thinking about how, in addition to scale and profitability, healthcare companies need to be super flexible, and they need to be able to adapt quickly to whatever might happen, pandemic wise or otherwise. So it's always an interesting trade-off that organizations have to make between scale and efficiency versus flexibility, patient experience, or customer experience, and really focusing on meeting the needs of customers. And those two things sometimes are in direct conflict. So it's more of a question or an observation than anything. But I don't know if you saw anything related to that in your research or findings.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting because you're looking at two sides of the spectrum, right? Like you have your streamlined operations, making things kind of run a little more smoothly, optimizing your dollars, but then also it's oftentimes you'll have to lean out. I imagine whether it's the healthcare industry or the any industry really. If you're buying a business, you're probably going to make changes to that business, and I'm curious about the pros and cons of it too, because obviously you're not going to buy a business if the pros don't outweigh the cons, right? But from an objective perspective, from someone who's outside looking in, I guess my question is, do you guys often see people losing their jobs if they go through an acquisition? What to what extent do the changes take place after an M&A?
Yeah, that's a tough question to answer. I guess it's a mix. So I'd say 10 or 20 years ago, earlier in my career, it was pretty common to see layoffs as part of an M&A event, or even any sort of transformation, whether it's a reorg or a big, massive process improvement initiative. I'd say 10 or 20 years ago, you were more likely to see significant layoffs as a result of those activities. Now, and I honestly don't know why this is, or I don't know if this is rooted in any sort of broader data that could back this, but this is just more qualitative observations. But it seems like more recently that's less common to have big layoffs. Certainly there's distressed companies that are losing money. They're out laying off people, and we're seeing a lot of organizations lay off people, throughout the pandemic. But generally, we're not seeing, at least in our experience, we're not seeing that be a result of some sort of M&A event or consolidation of companies. It may be that the opportunity is there and they're not taking advantage of it, or it could be that the organizations are still continuing to grow and there's going to be a need for those people, but they just don't need to hire as fast in the future as they continue the growth.
Right. Well, that's good news to hear that it's kind of pivoted and changed since a few years back. Because I would imagine if you're a smaller business or a smaller organization, whether you're in healthcare or another industry, it would almost be a saving grace if you're struggling to stay afloat and then you have someone come in and buy you out. That's almost the best case scenario.
Yeah, someone that could help you get to the next level or help you be more profitable. And even outside of healthcare, you see that a lot with a lot of organizations. In fact, right before this podcast, I was on a call with a potential client in the Middle East who is a very large company, and they've grown primarily through going out and acquiring all these different types of companies. Some of them in healthcare, but most of them in other industries like food and automotive manufacturing. They even have a taxi business in the region. So it's and this is obviously they've fueled most of their growth even pre-COVID, but they continue to go out and acquire these new companies. But it is fascinating to see how, on one hand, you have the entrepreneurial spirit that kind of fuels a lot of economic activity throughout the world, and that gets you to a certain point. But then on the other hand, you've got private equity and big companies out there that are trying to buy up these smaller companies to really take them to the next level. So it's an interesting dichotomy, I guess you'd say, that they kind of feed off each other, and it's pretty interesting.
That's super interesting. And this client, I mean, it sounds like they're buying across various industries, so that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Sounds hard to manage, but sounds like they're building an empire, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, just the thought of like a food company and a taxi company being in this, how do you manage those two things effectively? And the question becomes, and actually we were talking about this in the conversation of how do you leverage the potential efficiency gains by not having a separate IT department for each of those businesses or separate finance department or whatever the case may be. So a lot of, scale and standardization and efficiency opportunities. But to your point, even if there's no layoffs, and whether it's with this company we're working with or any other company out there, usually the impacts are pretty significant to the people and the processes within the organization.
Sure, just how like their day-to-day is run, etc. I could see that, definitely. Well, hey, maybe this client can start delivering food with their taxis.
Oh, there you go. Kind of taking Uber and Uber Eats and Grubhub and all those things to the next level of actually fully integrated supply chain. Actually, they should just go out and buy Uber Eats or Grubhub or one of those apps, and then they completely own the entire thing there.
Own the whole segment.
Yeah.
Do it.
Yeah. Well, good. So, yeah, this will be an interesting segue into the rest of the show here today, where we're going to cover that whole gamut of sort of the evolution of small business to large business. And
got that sunshine.